So we can write this update callback inline right here, or we can create a reference to a separate function, and that's what I'm going to do. So we'll call this function handle update cache, and we'll create it above our return. And within update, we get access to the cache as well as the response from our mutation. So first of all, this cache argument is also called proxy. That's another naming convention for it, but I think it's more straightforward to just call this cache. And cache comes with a number of utility functions that allows us to read and write queries to the cache using the data that we get back from our mutation. So remember that we're within create track here, so we're creating a track, and let's take a look at our cache one more time. So what we want to do is read from our get tracks query to get all of our tracks. We get our response, and then we want to tell the cache to update. We want to write to the cache and tell it to add this newly created track to the end. And that's going to immediately update what's displayed in our app. So first of all, to get this individual tracks, to get this track data, we're going to need to read from our get tracks query. So first we'll import up at the top get tracks query, and then we can say cache.read query. And by the way, read query will never make a request to our server. It's simply going to look in our cache for the query that we specify. So on the query attribute, we'll say get tracks query. And then we'll get back our data from that. So we'll put that in this data variable. And now we're going to take the data that comes back from our create track mutation when we execute it, and we're going to write it to the cache. So updating the cache will always follow this form of reading from it, reading from a particular query, getting the data, getting the response from the mutation, and then writing that query with the included data back to the cache. So if we revisit our create track mutation, we can see that the created track data is going to be on data.createTrack.track, and what's returned from read query is going to have the same shape as our get tracks query. So if we head back to our app component, if we look at the shape of that, our tracks array is going to come from data.tracks. So we can add this newly created track to the end of our tracks array by saying data.tracks.concat, and then from response we can destructure right here within the parameters data, and then if we add a colon we can destructure another level further to get create track. So to get the track data, to concatenate it to the end of this array, we can just pass in create track.track. Then to write this data back to our cache on the get tracks query, we can simply say cache.write query. And remember that this will never modify anything on our server, write query that is, only our cache. So once again, on write query, we need to specify the query that we're writing to, get tracks query, and then we need to pass through our updated data on this data property. When we use data.tracks.concat, however, it's just going to give us an updated tracks array. It's not going to give us the entire data object. So we need to specify on this data attribute in write query that we want to update just the tracks array. So we'll assign the return value of this updated array to the variable tracks, and then we'll pass that in to the data object here. And keep in mind that any time that we're updating an object or an array, that we do so in an immutable fashion. So we're using concat here because it gives us a copy of the original tracks array. It doesn't mutate the array, and this array would be mutated if we used the array method .push, for example. One final thing, keep in mind that now that we're adding an item immediately to our track list after we run create track, we have to request more fields on our create track mutation than we originally had. So we can see here in our list that each of the tracks have posted by data as well as a like count. So at the moment, if we look at our create track mutation once again, from the added track, we're just asking for the ID, title, description, and URL. To add the appropriate fields, we can head back to our app component, and from the get tracks query, we can grab both likes and posted by, as well as all of their subfields. And then we'll paste it in to what we're requesting from the created track. So now let's save create track and see if our process of updating the cache will work. So at the moment I have my cache open. I'm going to add a new track. And then if the mutation is successful, we should immediately see our track added to the screen. So as you can see, by reading and writing back to our get tracks query right after our track was created, we're now able to avoid making a network request with refetch queries and immediately display our result on the user's screen.